Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Al Monitor, and this week our guest is Dr. Sam Charap, senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and one of the top American experts on Russia and Ukraine. Before joining RAND in 2017, he was senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. That's where Sam and I first met. And prior to that, he served as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security and on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, covering Russia and Eurasia. Sam is fluent in Russian and proficient in Ukrainian, and has been a visiting researcher in both Moscow and Kiev. He holds a PhD in political science and an MPhil in Russian and East European studies from the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. His book, Everyone Loses: The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia, which he co-authored with Timothy Colton, was published in January 2017 and could not be more relevant today. My conversation with Sam Charap of the RAND Corporation about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what it means for the Middle East begins now. Sam, welcome to On the Middle East. Pleased to have you join our podcast today to talk about Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's get into it. Bring us up to date in your assessment. What is Putin's endgame now in Ukraine, where it seems the military advance, at least on Kiev, has not gone as he had hoped, as we read about Ukrainian resistance, high casualties, and supply and logistics bottlenecks for the Russian military? Is his plan still to depose the present government? And how do you assess his military operations elsewhere in the country, not just around Kiev, because Russia has taken Kherson, a city of 300,000 in the south, and seems to be making advances along the Black Sea?
So big question. Let's try to break it down a little bit. I think we haven't seen no sign that Putin is deviating from his, I'm not going to call it an endgame, and I'll get to that in a second, tactical objective of decapitating the Ukrainian government and replacing it. And the reason I don't call it an endgame is because I don't know how that actually results in a new stable equilibrium, a new political order in Ukraine. It's the kind of, as we've learned from bitter experience, ousting regimes does not lead to creation of new political orders. And we've seen no sign that there is a political game plan to accompany the military one. On the military side of things, in terms of what we can see about what's going on, it seems pretty clear that there's an attempt to encircle what I would imagine to be, although the Ukrainians have been much better about covering their tracks on social media than the Russians have, that the bulk of the Ukrainian forces still remain on the line of contact in the Donbass, and they've been pinned down there since this began from the separatist-held areas. But what you see with Kherson and Kharkiv is that those are the 2 points after which they're going to be, cut off. And, we should note in this context that there actually haven't been like force on force. There haven't been a lot of force on force battles yet of any significance. I think those would be to come if that move happens. Because the Ukrainians, of course, have been fighting a war of attrition in the Donbass and had most of their capabilities on the line of contact, and so this is one of the concerns I've had from the beginning, that that presents an opportunity for the Russian military to do what it likes to do, which is encircle adversary forces and then either force them to capitulate or pound them into smithereens. There seems to be a move to encircle the capital as well in parallel. And so I think these are separate military moves and all aimed at the same purpose, you know, and not only decapitating the regime, but also destroying Ukraine's military and its capabilities. As horrible as that sounds. So if you want to get into a little bit about the performance question, should we go there in terms of
Definitely.
Russian? Yeah. So it seems to me that this was a the interesting part is that the Russian military built up for this operation like they would for like they train for in terms of the capabilities that were brought forward. They have not executed the kind of fight that they train for, that exists in their doctrine. This was I think the initial operations were based on an assumption that that the Ukrainian government would fold like a house of cards. And so all it would take would be some sort of, you know, shock and awe and a couple of like daring like airborne troop landings, and that would be it. They would flee or something, and the military would capitulate. And that was a real miscalculation. And you know, led to these like airborne units being caught deep behind enemy lines without any logistical tail or support. It led to a, you know, not prioritizing the SEAD mission of suppressing enemy air defense. So, you know, the Ukrainian air defenses are still, some of them are still operating, which is shocking to me. And the Russian Air Force really has not been seen much. So I think the idea initially was to just, you know, that the Russian assumptions, and they always have a dim view of Ukraine and Ukrainian elites particularly, that the whole thing was a house of cards. It would just take a little push to collapse. And that was a miscalculation. And now what we're seeing is plan B, which is, you know, encircle the Ukrainian military, besiege cities, shell them if they don't capitulate. And I think, unfortunately, it's just a matter of time.
Sam, what did Putin and the Russian military learn, or perhaps mislearn, from their experiences in Syria? That's been a roughly 10-year engagement, which intensified in 2015 and was widely considered by Russians, as I understand it, a success. How influential was that experience in Syria for this war planning here in Ukraine?
You know, even just operationally, my assumptions going in were that the Russian aerospace forces, which have had extensive experience now, thanks to the operation in Syria, would have been, you know, at the tip of the spear in this context. But they have not been, you know, engaged in the kind of bombing campaigns that they were in Syria. Russia never had to worry about contested airspace or air defenses really in Syria. So it just makes it's a different environment. And you know, they're doing from their perspective precisely the opposite of what they did in Syria. In Syria, from their perspective, they were restoring the statehood of the country. That was the term used. And they relied on extensive local ground forces to support their operations, which were largely air-based. I mean, I don't really see any, frankly, ways in which they've leveraged that so far. The Air Force may well get involved, and the pilots that will be flying those planes will likely have, you know, flown sorties in Syria. So I think that's perhaps how I'd see the link, maybe. Otherwise, yeah, it's hard to see. I mean, even the things that we thought they would have taken away in terms of skills, we haven't seen on display yet. Now, these are early days, and it's hard to draw conclusions about a conflict a week in. you would know better than I, or you remember better than I, but how long did it take the US to take Baghdad in 2003? 3 weeks? We're not even, I mean, today is a week. So we'll see. But yeah, it has not, this is, I hesitate to make judgments about like the Russian military's capabilities in general as a result of this kind of real poor showing so far, or relatively poor showing so far, at least the initial bizarre actions from like sending in single units of the National Guard like into Kiev without any, without anyone else around them, to these airborne like troop suicide missions. But like they're not actually fighting the war. They weren't, at least the war that they trained for, and the war that they, we see them preparing for when they do their exercises.
The U.S. and our NATO allies are talking about sending even more arms to Ukraine. How would you envision if this goes on beyond 3 weeks?
So I think a big question mark is whether there's a government in 3 weeks or not, or the legitimate elected government is still in power in Kiev. And I don't know. I think a lot of, obviously, the other variables stem from that, because it's one thing to be supporting a uniform military controlled by a government, even though they've lost control of the airspace more or less, and control of some key areas on the ground. It's another thing to be supporting either a government in exile or a kind of insurgent movement, or so there's so many variables that have yet to play out that it's hard to see what the modalities of assistance will be. I think what is clear is that particularly the Europeans, the sort of visceral reaction to Russian brutality has surprised, I think, even themselves. You see countries like Finland. I mean, Germany was the big initial U-turn, but countries like Finland and Norway, which don't tend to do this kind of thing, pledging assistance, even Italy. So my short-term concern is that somebody needs to be coordinating all of that. But longer term, the modalities of whom we're assisting and how are going to be very tricky if the Russian military is in control, at least of Ukraine, up to the river, and or plus parts of the south that's on the other side of the river. I just don't know how that works. I mean, and I don't know what the Russians' plan is for the west of the country, which would be the land routes in. Like, do they really think that regime that they install would be able to control the west of the country? That seems like a stretch. So are we in a sort of Balkanization scenario? I mean, it's hard to know. And do they actually plan to partition the country? I mean, these are all, I think, at this point, it's so hard to know what the post-immediate conflict status quo will be. That answering, modalities about how external actors behave is tough.
Sam, the sanctions are already imposing a terrible cost on the Russian economy. And the country, as you mentioned, is diplomatically isolated, at least in the West. There's a lot of talk in the media about Putin's isolation, including from powerful oligarchs who have previously been part of his inner circle. In your view, is Putin himself in jeopardy by the sanctions and the diplomatic isolation? And how stable and resilient is his government, and how wide the opposition to the war? Or to put it succinctly, is regime change a possibility?
So this is by far the most risk that Putin has exposed his political system to of anything he's ever done. His actions have undermined the core of his popular support, which is relative economic prosperity and sort of rescuing Russia from the chaos of the 90s, which, by the way, were characterized by things like massive devaluation of the currency and economic instability, the kind of things that have already happened a week into the war. Russia, the level of repression in Russia is almost hard to keep track of. It's going so quickly up, you know, the kind of media that I read and listen to and watch. I've just, you know, Echo of Moscow was just shut down today. The Dosh TV station, the last remaining sort of independent one, was shut down. Like there are lots of rumors that tomorrow martial law is going to be declared. So, you know, I think events have been set in motion domestically, both by the sanctions and by the Russian response to the war, which was obviously going to be repressive, but the extent of it is really breathtaking. And also the extent to which, you know, the free market has been limited in the last week in response to the sanctions. You know, there are forces have been set in play that we haven't seen in Russian politics ever, and it's hard to know how that will end. You know, long-term stability, obviously, there are major question marks now. In the short term, there's likely to be more of a, I mean, I think that the Russian government's control of the information space, which is only accelerated, right, with the throttling of various social media sites and the shutting down of others, will allow them, I think, to get through this initial most acute period without facing, you know, the kind of instability that would threaten their rule. I think, you know, Putin has so thoroughly cleared the political spectrum of any hint of organized opposition, and you know the population was pretty demoralized. I mean, the sort of potential basis for protests was pretty demoralized before this began. You know, through the arrest of Navalny and the repression of any public opposition, public organized opposition. So there's, yeah, and we don't see any evidence yet of elite splits. It would be sort of hard to imagine within that system an organized, you know, sort of within system palace coup type scenario. So regime change, you know, the other problem with it is that many in the system, including I think Putin himself, equate regime change with, you know, like regime security equals national security. Public protests, they see always the hand of external actors inciting, you know, the masses. So the kind of lashing out that we could expect in that context is you know, scary. So, you know, these kinds of personalistic authoritarian regimes, they obviously they don't last forever, but and when they do change, they change quite rapidly and unexpectedly. And I think basically the way to think about this is that these actions and the Western response and the Russian reaction to that have created like the kind of systemic risks that Putin spent 25 years trying to eliminate. Now, granted, he himself has, by really doubling down on the personalistic nature of the regime by passing these constitutional amendments in 2020 and you know, weakening all the other political institutions in Russia, he sort of set the stage for this. But this is really the apogee. I mean, it's hard to see, you know. So, like, long story short, medium to long term, there are the government's going to have to be dealing with a lot of problems if it wants to avoid like really negative outcomes. In the short term, I just think that in wartime, and with the competent repressive apparatus, I wouldn't bet on regime change. The other thing I would say about regime change is like careful what you wish for. Why should anyone be confident that the person who comes to power after Putin is going to be a dove and not a hardliner, or even a more hardliner than Putin? So, you know, I think there, I often get the sense these days that people in this town in Washington can sort of smell blood in the water and are eager to deliver the death blow. But I just don't. Careful what you wish for is what I would say. As horrible as this regime is, and as terrible the war that they're waging is, I don't know that going down that road is going to end well for anyone.
Sam, there are increasingly louder calls for a US or NATO-backed no-fly zone, which would put us on a possible collision course with Russia, the country with, among other things, the world's largest nuclear arsenal. You wrote this week in the Financial Times that these events can spiral, and there is a need for the US and Russian militaries to maintain a channel to prevent mishaps that could lead to unwanted and unforeseen escalation. Do you support a no-fly zone? And more broadly, how serious do you think Putin is when he talks about putting his nuclear weapons on alert?
A no-fly zone would require the NATO or the United States to shoot down Russian aerospace forces operating in Ukrainian airspace. It's not a trivial matter. It would be direct US intervention in the war. Let's just be honest about it. I don't think that's on the table. I think there's sort of, well, let me put it this way. It's one of those things that I consider to be very low probability at the moment. That said, the central bank sanctions are probably like 11 out of 10 on what I was expecting on sanctions. I think what anyone was expecting on sanctions, and particularly so soon. So I wouldn't rule it out completely because of how the response has been so intense and completely morally justified. But a no-fly zone, people should be honest that that's really war with Russia, and I think the Biden administration wants to avoid that. As was reported in Politico, I am pushing on an open door, at least when it comes to the U.S. and a desire to maintain not only just mil communications, but also to establish some sort of deconfliction mechanism along the lines of what, in fact, was what they did in Syria. Politico has reported that the U.S. has essentially proposed this, and really has the Russians aren't answering the phone, which is disconcerting. But so I think, given that there are going to be Russian aircraft operating in much closer proximity and conducting combat operations in much closer proximity to NATO airspace than there were a week ago, the deconfliction thing makes sense. It's and it's a good thing that the Biden administration is pursuing it. The question of nuclear escalation is something that I think we all should, be concerned about, but not in the, the way we get there. I think is Russia is a Russia-NATO conflict, right? And I don't think Russia is going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I think it has enough conventional weapons to accomplish its immediate military tasks. But if it sees, NATO prepared to intervene, that's when I get worried. And they don't have a huge number of conventional long-range strike missiles in the magazine, and once those run out, and if there's a conflict with NATO, they're going to go for what's there, which is the non-strategic nuclear weapons.
How do you assess Russia's cyber capabilities relative to the United States and the West? And do you think that Putin would consider a cyber response at this point?
Frankly, I'm surprised that we haven't seen one already. I am no cyber expert, but I do know that how Russia perceives what the sanctions, how Russia perceives Western sanctions, which is economic warfare on their homeland. And I did not expect them to take that sitting down. And I still would expect some sort of non-kinetic response on our homeland as a retaliation. And it may well be just a matter of time. Maybe they don't want to be fighting both conflicts that they're fighting, engaged in both levels of conflict at the same time. But that's the means that Russia has to have a non-kinetic effect on on Western homelands, so to speak. It's their asymmetric advantage relative to their economic weight. I mean, they can't impose sanctions on us, although to a limited extent they can. In fact, I haven't seen it yet, but for example, Boeing depends on titanium from Russia. I mean, even once they close the airspace to U.S. airlines, it's going to be a whole lot harder for folks to fly to Asia, or just longer, because many flights from the U.S. go over the pole and over Siberia. But those are relatively trivial by comparison to what we've done to the Russian economy. So I am concerned about a Russian cyber response. And frankly, that has been one of the shoes that has not dropped yet, even in Ukraine, frankly. There have been obviously some cyber attacks, but either the Russians aren't trying as much as we thought they would have, or they haven't tried yet, or the Ukrainians are better defenders than we expected, or it's just harder to achieve effects in the cyber domain during a conventional conflict than we expected. I mean, this is one of the first cases where a major cyber power is fighting in a context where cyber could have been used to supplement conventional military operations. Why is the internet still working in Ukraine is an interesting question, or like government communications. But again, I think it's early days yet, and Russia's very capable in this domain. I think the thing about cyber is that there are a lot of unknowns about what kind of damage can be, what can be done with cyber, and we might be about to test those or to find answers to those questions.
There's also talk about imposing an embargo or sanction on Russian oil exports. Russia has the largest national natural gas reserves in the world and the 8th largest oil reserves. Do you see that happening? And is cutting off Russian energy exports or financing for them a good move in your mind? And would Putin, in such a case, even consider cutting off his gas exports to the West in response? Europe counts on Russian gas for about 40% of its energy needs.
I see this as really unlikely. Well, let me put it this way. That is I think that might be the sort of, I hesitate to use the word nuclear, because we might actually have nuclear, the escalation problems. But that is the sort of highest level of sanction, and the one that risks the most blowback for Americans and Europeans, right? I mean, oil is already over $100 a barrel. If we really place an embargo on Russian oil exports, you said it has the 8th largest supplies. I believe it's the largest exporter, though. Either Russia or Saudi, and they're 1 and 2, and sometimes they switch off. I forget who's exporting the most right now. But taking that supply out, I don't think it's something that OPEC. First of all, it's unclear that OPEC would compensate for it, and second of all, the pricing implications. I mean, I don't think we could overcome that with our strategic reserves. So I would imagine that given the emphasis being placed on avoiding as much as possible the imposing pain on the American and European publics, that would be something that was resorted to in the short term. But a lot of things have surprised me so far in terms of the Western response. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out completely.
Let's shift to the Middle East for a minute. Do you see any connection between what is happening in Ukraine and the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal, which are reportedly in their final days? And play out for us the scenarios for Russia if there is a deal and if there isn't, with regard to Russia's dealing with Iran and the region.
The extent of Russian retaliation for the sanctions is, going to be an unfolding question, and there will be areas where they see themselves mostly as doing favors to us, or that it's something that we want in the international context is more important to us than it is to them, or just doesn't have that much inherent value to them. There, I could see Russia going out of their way to try to undermine, U.S. policy. The JCPOA, I think, is different because Russia wants the JCPOA back in effect. And, I think, given that it's the so that's my bottom line about the way it would affect Russian policy on the JCPOA. In other cases in the Middle East, though, I think this new, level of conflict between Russia and the West and Russia and NATO is going to play out in different ways. So, like, I would be careful if I were in Idlib right now. Given that the Turks are making noises about sort of not allowing more naval forces to rotate in and out of the Black Sea. Although it's, what they're actually planning to do is pretty unclear, but that's another story. Or in other places where Russia can make trouble for those countries that it sees engaged in, an attack on the Russian homeland, fair or not, that's another story. I think that's just how they see it. So the gloves would come off in certain contexts in ways that they weren't before. And I think that might explain some of the, like, for example, Israeli attempts at balancing here, because they don't want to see Russia retaliate against Israel and Israeli interests in the Middle East. It's been interesting to see, for example, the UAE being, abstaining on that key UN Security Council vote. I think, Russia's reestablishment of regional clout in the Middle East has, changed the way key Middle Eastern countries have responded to the crisis. And I think potentially, this is the sort of way that they've cashed in on the political capital in the region that they've created by, to a certain extent, probably the most one could have hoped for, avoiding full-blown bandwagoning with the US. We'll see over time how that plays out, but that's been my observation so far.
While the West seems mostly committed to Putin's isolation, we've talked about that. You said it's an 11 on a 1 to 10 scale so far in the response with regard to sanctions. Help us understand how Russia is managing its relations with the East, especially China and India. And India, also on the Security Council, abstained on that vote last week.
Yeah, India, of course, is a major customer of Russia's military-industrial complex, and is in a really tight spot here. That's not, that kind of a relationship is not something you can just switch to other providers in any kind of plausible short. They do co-development. It's the only country Russia does co-development with. It's a really extensive military-industrial relationship there. I think Russia's going to increasingly come to rely on China. And so that relationship has just become so much more central to Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, Russia will do China's bidding, but China has a whole lot more leverage, and Russia has far fewer options. That said, I don't think China wants Russia to fail. I don't think it, is particularly thrilled about this because, from what I understand, like Xi's not ready to act on when it comes to Taiwan yet. The PLA isn't. So it's not like that they're seeing this as a bonanza for them to take advantage of in the short term, and they probably were, are concerned about some of the global economic implications, but they're not going to allow Russia to fail, or they're going to try to help to avoid Russia failing, even if they're going to try to also balance their economic stakes with the United States, with that, um, uh, with these other priorities.
And what does Putin expect from Xi in China?
So one thing about the Russia-China relationship that was true before this, and probably will remain true after it, is that they do not expect each other to agree on everything, because they see each other as fellow great powers, which have certain, interests that diverge, but, they manage those disagreements and focus on the positive and don't allow the disagreements to derail the sort of fundamental achievements in their relationship as they see it. And part of the managing disagreements and sort of the management of that relationship, which they had conducted very well, is not owning each other's problems. And so, Russia doesn't support the US position on the South China Sea or whatever, but like it also has this very close relationship with Vietnam, and supplies Vietnam with a whole lot of weaponry, and explores, had projects exploring natural gas fields in areas of the South China Sea that Vietnam and China contested, et cetera, et cetera. So just as China had a very significant military industrial relationship with Ukraine, and I think there was an interesting parallel there. So I don't think Putin expects Xi to necessarily help, because the idea is that you don't own the other's problems, but that he certainly expects him not to help him play defense, I would imagine, and diplomatically, economically, and to not to impede, not to sort of cause Russia any problems, so to speak, as it's carrying this out.
Sam, last question. The title of your 2017 book on Russia-Ukraine tensions was called "Everyone Loses," and it's hard to imagine today that either Russia or Ukraine will be better off than they were on February 22nd, before Russia's invasion. How does this end, and what would you envision is the best, most likely, and worst case scenarios given where we are today?
The best case scenario in the short term is also, I think, highly unlikely at this stage, is some sort of settlement that avoids, that allows the Ukrainian government to survive and ends the active phase of the fighting, and returns Russian forces to the sort of status quo ante of where they were. That is like unfortunately, it seems, it's not impossible to imagine, but it seems highly unlikely at this stage. The problem with imagining endgames, if Russia does succeed in ousting the Ukrainian government, is that I don't know what the off-ramp is then for anyone, for us too. Like we will be forced to escalate by what Russia did, because of how outrageous that action will be, and would be if it occurs. And I think I don't know what the stable equilibrium within Ukraine looks like after that. I can't imagine stable governance under Russian occupation. I don't know what the stable equilibrium looks like inside of Russia with all this economic pressure on it. And I don't know what the stable equilibrium looks like in the international system with Russia, with like being essentially North Koreaized. You know, there's a fundamental difference between both Iran and North Korea and Russia, and that is that Russia plays a significant role in the international system. And if one of the sort of core players and the key players in the international system is like treated as a pariah state by most of the other players in the international system, I just don't know how that system continues to function in the way it did. So it's just, that's the scariest part of the phase of the conflict that we're in right now, is that it's hard to see off ramps and it's hard to see new equilibria emerging. Now, things might be more clear. We're in the fog of war and the heat of the conflict. So making judgments about the future is doubly hard. But right now, it's hard for me to see what a new kind of stability looks like.
Sam, thank you. This has been great. I always learn from you about Russia and Ukraine and Europe. We've been colleagues at the IISS and at RAND. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's been a pleasure, and I wish I had happier news to report.
We will return after this short break.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest, Dr. Sam Charap, and our production team of Beowulf Rockland and Rosabelle Hine of Two Squared Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all three of our podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel, whose guest this month is Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa, CEO of the digital media website Rappler. And On Israel with Ben Caspit, where Ben this week speaks with Israeli diplomat Yaki Dayan about whether Israel has a role to play in mediating the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And of course, this podcast On the Middle East, where I will be here again next week with another decision maker or thought leader from the region. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the Middle East at almonitor.com.